Why does a staff sergeant with over a decade of professional service suddenly forget how to shoot? The question hung in the Nevada heat like something poisonous. For 2 weeks straight, Mara Keene failed every combat drill they put in front of her. Easy shots went wide. Reloads that should have been muscle memory turned into fumbled disasters. On the obstacle course, a single flashbang stopped her cold, frozen like someone who'd never heard one before. The whispers started small. Maybe she'd slipped into the program by mistake. Some administrative error. Others said she was dragging her team down on purpose. Self-sabotage. A quiet breakdown nobody wanted to acknowledge. The instructors had heard enough excuses. One more failure and she'd be gone. But on the day her dismissal seemed certain, a black SUV rolled onto the range. A SEAL commander stepped out. He didn't ask questions. He didn't review her scores. He just gave a single sharp order. 3 words she hadn't heard in years. But what were those words, and why did they change everything? The transport van's brakes squealed against the desert heat as it rolled to a stop outside the Advanced Combat Training Facility. Staff Sergeant Mara Keene stepped down onto cracked asphalt, her left leg taking the impact with a slight hitch she'd learned to disguise as careful movement. Mid-30s. Unremarkable in every way the Army had taught her to be. Plain fatigues, dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun so tight it looked severe. The only thing that stood out were her eyes. Dark brown. Constantly moving, cataloging exits and angles without seeming to try, old habits from places where awareness meant survival. Staff Sergeant Keene, reporting for Class Bravo 12. The admin sergeant slid a key card across the counter without looking up. Second floor, room 214. Don't be late for briefings. These instructors don't care what you did before you got here. The barracks smelled like industrial disinfectant and 30 years of boots. Mara claimed a bunk in the far corner, last row, clear view of the entrance, back to the wall. She arranged her gear with precision that bordered on compulsive. Every item in its place, every strap exactly where it needed to be. Not because regulations required it, because survival had. At evening chow, she sat alone near the windows. Tray organized with military precision. 3 tables over, a group of younger soldiers were discussing scores loud enough for half the room to hear. Lieutenant Markham had the kind of easy confidence that came from never being truly tested. Perfect uniform, perfect posture, perfect teeth. The 3 nodding along were cut from similar cloth. Peters, skinny and nervous. Torres, built like a gym poster. Miller, sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued. Some people get here because they can still do the job. Markham's voice carried. Others get here because someone feels sorry for them. When Mara walked past their table, the conversation died. Torres muttered something that made the others chuckle. She didn't react, but she filed their faces away for later reference. The way you memorize terrain before moving through it. The way you catalog threats without ever acknowledging you've seen them. She told herself it didn't matter. Let them think what they wanted. But something small and sharp twisted in her chest anyway. Not anger. Something older than that. Something that tasted like all the times she'd been invisible until she wasn't. All the times silence had been the only weapon she was authorized to use. The rifle qualification range stretched out under desert sky the next morning. Target silhouettes wavering at 200 meters. Should have been easy shooting for anyone with advanced training. Mara's first shot went wide. The reload that should have been automatic fumbled. Fingers angling the magazine wrong. Precious seconds bleeding away while everyone else was already back to shooting. When time was called, her target looked like someone learning to shoot instead of someone who'd been doing it professionally for over a decade. Keene, the instructor's voice didn't hide his disappointment. You're going to need to do better than that. Behind her, Markham's voice carried just loud enough. Guess some people's qualification records don't transfer. Wonder what else doesn't transfer. Peters snickered. Torres cracked his knuckles. Miller just smiled. That sharp little smile that cut without drawing blood. Mara kept walking, one foot in front of the other, eyes forward, breathing controlled, the same way she'd walked through hostile territory, The same way she'd moved through places where showing emotion could get you killed. But this was different. This wasn't enemy territory. These were supposed to be her people, and somehow that made it worse. That night she sat on her bunk in the dark, hands trembling slightly, not from fear, from the effort of keeping everything locked down, contained. The muscle memory wanted to flow, wanted to move the way it had moved for 3 years, but she couldn't let it. Not here, not without permission. The conditioning ran deeper than muscle, deeper than thought. It was woven into her nervous system like scar tissue. Sometimes she wondered if they'd broken something in her that couldn't be fixed. If the ghost knife program had taken a soldier and turned her into something that didn't quite work anymore. A machine with parts that no longer fit together the way they should. The urban combat course was built from shipping containers and plywood. A maze of rooms and corridors designed to simulate the kind of close quarters fighting that had defined 2 decades of war. It smelled like sawdust and simulated gunpowder, echoing with the sharp reports of training ammunition and the shouts of instructors calling out hits and misses. Moving through it should have been like breathing for someone with Mara's experience. But when her turn came to run the kill house, everything that should have been automatic felt forced, artificial, like trying to remember how to walk after years of running. She stacked up outside the first door, weapon ready, breathing controlled. The instructor gave her the go signal and she moved, but not fast enough. The paper target inside had time to kill the cardboard hostage before she could engage. The buzzer sounded. Red light. Failure. Again the instructor called. And this time keen, remember that hesitation kills people. She tried to push through the next door faster, but her angles were wrong. Muzzle too high on the first sweep, too low on the second. By the time she'd cleared the room, 2 more teammates were marked as casualties. The sound of airsoft rounds snapping past her head made her shoulders tense in ways that had nothing to do with the training scenario. For just a moment, she wasn't in a plywood room in the Nevada desert. She was somewhere else entirely, somewhere darker and more dangerous, where the bullets weren't simulated and the people shooting them weren't instructors. Keen, the voice cut through whatever memory had grabbed her. You still with us? She blinked, oriented herself, finished the run, but the damage was done. Her final score was near the bottom of the board, and everyone could see it. Back in the staging area, Markham made sure his voice carried when he talked to his crew. That was painful to watch. Seriously painful. Someone's going to get hurt if she keeps freezing up like that. Maybe she should try a different line of work, Miller added, something safer, like accounting. Torres flexed his shoulders, a gesture that seemed casual but drew attention to exactly how much bigger he was than most people in the room. I don't know what she did before this, but it sure wasn't combat. Peters laughed high and nervous. Maybe she was a cook or something, rear echelon stuff. They weren't being subtle about it. Half the people in the staging area could hear them, including the instructors, but they kept their voices just on the right side of what could be called constructive criticism rather than harassment. Plausible deniability, the kind of cruelty that leaves no marks. Mara finished cleaning her weapon in silence, checked her gear, walked out without acknowledging any of it, but her hands were shaking again, and this time it wasn't from containment. It was from something rawer, something that felt like shame even though she knew she had nothing to be ashamed of. She was doing exactly what she'd been conditioned to do, following orders that had been embedded so deep they'd become part of her biology. But knowing that didn't make it hurt less. That night she stood in the shower until the water ran cold, letting it wash over her, trying to wash away the voices, the looks, the quiet certainty in their eyes that she didn't belong, that she'd somehow fooled her way this far and now everyone could see the truth. She pressed her forehead against the tile, closed her eyes, and for just a moment let herself feel the weight of it, the isolation, the humiliation, the crushing loneliness of being the only person in the room who knew what was really happening. Somewhere in the distance she could hear laughter, someone's celebration, someone who'd passed their drills, someone who got to feel proud instead of broken. She wondered what that felt like, to move through the world without carrying invisible chains, to be good at something and have everyone see it, to belong. But that wasn't her story, not anymore, maybe not ever again. The discharge recommendation appeared in her file on the morning of day 13. Mara saw it in the way the senior instructor looked at her during breakfast, that combination of pity and relief that said the decision had already been made. They were just waiting for the right moment to make it official. One more day, maybe two. Then she'd be gone, transferred to some administrative posting where her failures wouldn't endanger anyone, where she could fade into the background and disappear completely. She should have felt something about that, fear, anger, desperation, but all she felt was numb, a distant kind of acceptance. Maybe they were right. Maybe the injury had broken something that couldn't be fixed. Maybe she was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with being useful. The morning drills started like all the others. Markham and his crew already warming up, Torres doing pull-ups to show off, Miller checking his gear with theatrical precision, Peters laughing at something that probably wasn't funny. They didn't look at her anymore. She'd become invisible again, not the dangerous kind of invisible, just the forgettable kind, the kind that meant you'd already lost. But then something changed. A black SUV rolled onto the range. Government plates, tinted windows, the kind of vehicle that showed up when conversations needed to stay off the record. It parked away from the main buildings, engines still running, and everyone stopped what they were doing to watch. A man stepped out, tall, late 40s, the kind of physical presence that made you instinctively check your posture, navy uniform, seal trident gleaming in the desert sun. He didn't hurry, didn't look around nervously, just moved with the absolute confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was supposed to be, commander's insignia on his collar. But there was something else about him, something that made even the instructors straighten up without being told. Master Chief Rains approached him first. Brief handshake, quiet conversation that nobody else could hear. Then both men turned and looked directly at Mara, not at the group, not at the range, at her, specifically, unmistakably. Keen, Rains called out, front and center. The walk across the range felt longer than it should have, every step measured, every breath controlled. She didn't know what this was, didn't know who this commander was or why he was here, but something deep in her chest was starting to wake up, something that had been sleeping for 2 weeks, something that recognized authority when it saw it. Staff Sergeant Keene, the commander said. His voice was quiet, calm, but there was weight behind it, the kind of weight that came from years of giving orders that meant life or death. I'm Commander Maddox. I need you to run the kill house course. One more time. Sir Rain started. We already have her scores from yesterday, I don't think. I wasn't asking for your opinion, Chief. Maddox's tone didn't change, didn't sharpen, but somehow that made it more absolute. I need to see her run it again. Right now. Mara felt her pulse kick up, not from anxiety, from something else, something that felt like recognition, like her body knew something her conscious mind hadn't caught up to yet. She glanced at Maddox's face, saw something there that made her breath catch. Not disappointment, not pity, something that looked almost like expectation. Yes, sir, she heard herself say, ready when you are. The kill house loomed ahead, same shipping containers, same plywood walls, same course she'd failed twice already. Behind her she could hear other trainees gathering to watch, probably hopping to see her fail one more time before she got kicked out, probably placing bets on how badly she'd mess it up. But their voices seemed distant now, muffled, like she was hearing them through water. Maddox walked beside her to the starting position, close enough that nobody else could hear when he spoke. His next words were barely above a whisper. 3 words, simple, direct, but they hit her system like an electrical charge. Ghost knife active. Everything changed. It wasn't gradual, wasn't a slow return to confidence. It was instantaneous, like a switch flipping, like chains falling away. The muscle memory she'd been fighting to contain for 2 weeks suddenly released all at once. Her breathing steadied, Her vision sharpened, the trembling in her hands stopped, and suddenly the course in front of her wasn't a test anymore. It was just terrain, just angles and distances and threat assessments. Just work. The instructor gave the signal and Mara moved. But this time she moved the way she'd been trained to move. The way she'd moved in places nobody here had ever seen. The way someone moves when hesitation means death and precision means survival. She hit the first door with her shoulder already turning, weapon up. 2 rounds center mass on the target before the cardboard hostage even registered as separate. Smooth pivot. Second room. Third. Each entry flowing into the next without pause, without thought. Just pure execution. Behind her she could hear shouting, confusion, instructors yelling at each other trying to figure out what they were seeing, but it was just noise, static, nothing that mattered. What mattered was the next door, the next room, the next threat. Her mind was already 3 moves ahead, reading the space the way you read a book you've memorized, knowing where the dangers were before she saw them, moving through the course like she'd designed it herself. The final room had multiple targets, hostages mixed with threats in positions designed to force mistakes. Most trainees took 8 or 9 seconds to clear it, careful, methodical, trying not to shoot the wrong person. Mara cleared it in 2, 1 fluid motion, 3 threats down, 2 hostages untouched. The buzzer sounded, but this time it wasn't failure. It was a time that made the electronic board pause for a moment before displaying it, like even the machine couldn't quite believe what it was showing. 14 seconds, total course time, 14 seconds. The previous course record was 41. Mara lowered her weapon, breathing still controlled, heart rate barely elevated. She turned to face the stunned silence, and for the first time in 2 weeks she felt like herself, not broken, not contained, just exactly what she'd been trained to be. The looks on their faces were worth every moment of humiliation. Markham's easy confidence shattered completely. Tor's had stopped flexing. Miller's sharp smile was gone, replaced by something that looked like fear. Peters just stared, mouth open, trying to process what he'd just witnessed. But Mara didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't say a word. She just stood there, weapon at low ready, waiting for the next order, because that's what ghost knife operatives did. They didn't celebrate, they didn't explain, they just executed the mission and waited for the next one. Commander Maddox approached with the same measured pace he'd maintained throughout. No hurry, no celebration, just quiet satisfaction. That'll do, Staff Sergeant. Secure your weapon. Yes, sir. Chief, Maddox said to Rains without taking his eyes off Mara. I think we need to have a conversation about Staff Sergeant Keene's record. The debriefing room was small and windowless, the kind of space designed for conversations that needed to stay private. Mara sat at the table, rifle disassembled for cleaning, while Maddox and Rains tried to process what they'd just witnessed. The silence stretched out, heavy, full of questions nobody quite knew how to ask. Ghost knife, Rains said slowly. That's not in any manual I've read. Maddox leaned back in his chair, measuring his words carefully, because it's not supposed to be. Classified program, need-to-know basis, small teams, deep penetration, high-value targets in denied areas. His eyes moved to Mara, and Keene was part of this. She was the best part of it. The weight in those words settled over the room like something physical. Rains looked at Mara differently now, not with pity, not with disappointment, with something closer to awe, and maybe a little bit of fear, the healthy kind. The kind that came from understanding you'd been sitting next to someone genuinely dangerous without realizing it. 3 years operating in places that don't officially exist, Maddox continued. Doing things that never officially happened. Perfect mission record. 0 friendly casualties. Extraction rate of 100%. He paused, letting that sink in. 100%, Chief. Do you know how rare that is? Rains was quiet for a long moment. Then, so what happened? Why the transfer to regular training? Mara's hands paused in their cleaning routine for just a moment before continuing. Took a hit on the last mission. IED. Close quarters. Hostile territory. medical rotation stateside while they decided if I was still fit for duty. The Ghost Knife program requires very specific psychological conditioning, Maddox explained. Operators learn to compartmentalize, to suppress certain responses until they receive proper authorization codes. It's a safety measure, keeps them from going operational during routine activities. Authorization codes, Rains repeated, like what you said on the course. Exactly. Maddox nodded. Without the proper trigger phrase, Ghost Knife operatives appear to be normal soldiers with normal limitations. With it, he gestured toward the window where Mara's course record was still being analyzed by incredulous instructors. They become what they were trained to be. Rains was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. So for 2 weeks she was essentially what? Acting. Not acting, Mara said quietly. Her voice was soft, but there was steel underneath it. Contained. The conditioning isn't something you turn on and off like a switch. It's more like keeping a leash on a guard dog. It's still a guard dog, but it won't bite until someone gives it permission. And the fumbled drills, the missed shots, Rains asked, that was all real. Mara met his eyes, every second of it. Do you know what it feels like to know exactly how to do something and physically not be able to? To have the muscle memory right there, wanting to flow and having to fight it down. To fail at things you've done thousands of times. She paused. It's like drowning in shallow water. You know how to swim, but something won't let you. The brass wanted to see if she could function in conventional units after her injury, Maddox said. They thought maybe the conditioning had been compromised, that she'd lost the ability to operate at that level. And had she, Rains asked, you saw what happened out there, Chief. Does that look compromised to you? The silence that followed was answer enough. Mara went back to cleaning her rifle, hands steady now. No trembling, no hesitation. Just the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this so many times it was closer to meditation than maintenance. Outside, voices were still raised in confusion and disbelief. Instructors trying to explain what they'd seen. Trainees trying to reconcile the failure they'd been mocking with the performance they'd just witnessed. But in this small room, there was only understanding. Only the quiet recognition that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones you'd never suspect. The ones who look ordinary until the moment someone gives them permission to be extraordinary. I want to ask you something, Rain said to Mara. Personal question. She looked up, nodded slightly. Those 2 weeks, all the mockery, all the whispers, the discharge recommendation, did you ever want to just show them, just prove them wrong? Mara considered this for a long moment. Every single day, she said finally. Every time Markham made a comment. Every time Torres flexed to remind me how much bigger he was. Every time Miller smiled that sharp little smile. Every single time I wanted to drop the act and show them exactly what I was capable of. So why didn't you? It wasn't just because you weren't authorized. You could have said something, could have told them to back off. Because, Mara said quietly, part of being what I am means accepting that most people will never know, never understand. The mission isn't about proving myself to people who don't have the clearance to know I exist. It's about doing the job regardless of who sees it or who believes in me. She reassembled the rifle in smooth, practiced motions. And because, she added, there's a kind of strength in enduring what you don't have to fight, in being underestimated and choosing to stay quiet anyway, not because you can't defend yourself, but because defending yourself isn't the mission. Rains nodded slowly. That's a lonely way to live. Yes, Mara agreed, it is. The course record stayed on the board for the rest of the program. A stark reminder that sometimes appearances could be deceiving. Mara's name sat at the top in clean block letters, her time untouched despite 2 more weeks of attempts by increasingly motivated trainees. The discharge recommendation vanished from her file within hours. In its place appeared a new assignment: Advanced Tactical Instructor, Special Operations Training Command. Not a demotion or a lateral move, but a recognition of capabilities. that few people even knew existed. Markham and his crew became notably quieter after the exercise. No more nicknames, no more casual harassment. They'd seen something that didn't fit into their understanding of how the world worked, and it had shaken them more than they wanted to admit. They'd spent 2 weeks building their identity around being better than her, and then watched her casually demolish every assumption they'd made about themselves and the world around them. Peters tried to apologize one evening, caught Mara outside the mess hall, hands in his pockets, eyes on the ground. "Look, we didn't know about what you could do, I mean." Mara considered this for a moment. "Most people don't," she said. "That's kind of the point." "But why didn't you just, show them earlier? Save yourself all the grief." Her answer was simple and devastating. "Because I wasn't authorized to." Peter stood there for a moment longer, trying to think of something else to say. But what was there? "Sorry I mocked you for following orders that were literally embedded in your nervous system. Sorry I assumed failure meant weakness when it actually meant discipline." He walked away without another word, and Mara let him go. Because some lessons couldn't be taught. They had to be learned through humiliation. Torres and Miller kept their distance, speaking to her only when required for training purposes. But Raines noticed they'd started studying her technique during exercises, trying to understand how someone could move through a space with such absolute confidence, how someone could make warfare look like choreography. They'd never understand. Not really. Because understanding required context they'd never have, clearance they'd never get, experience they'd hopefully never need. But Markham was the most affected. The easy arrogance that had defined him for 2 weeks was gone, replaced by a quiet uncertainty that made him second-guess every decision. He'd built his identity around being the best, the natural leader, the obvious choice for advanced assignments, and then he'd watched someone he dismissed as broken casually surpass every standard he'd ever set for himself. One afternoon, Mara found him alone on the range, just standing there, staring at the targets like they held answers to questions he hadn't figured out how to ask yet. She almost walked past, almost left him to work through whatever he was working through, but something made her stop. "You want to know the difference between us?" she asked. Markham turned, surprised, cautious. "Yeah, I guess I do." "You think being good means never failing," Mara said, "never showing weakness, never letting anyone see you struggle. So when you see someone failing, you assume they're less than you, weaker, not worth your respect." She paused, but real strength isn't about never falling down. It's about getting back up when everything in you wants to stay down. It's about enduring humiliation without breaking, about being underestimated and not letting it define you. Markham was quiet for a long moment. "I was wrong about you." "Yes," Mara agreed, "you were." "I'm sorry." She looked at him, really looked, saw genuine remorse there, genuine understanding. Maybe he'd learned something after all. Maybe humiliation had taught him what confidence never could. "I know," she said. And then she walked away. Because acceptance wasn't about making him feel better. It was about him learning to be better. Commander Maddox departed the morning after the revelation, shaking hands with Raines, offering Mara a brief nod of acknowledgement. No long goodbyes, no dramatic speeches, just the quiet professionalism of people who understood that some stories were meant to stay classified. But before he left, he pulled Raines aside for a final conversation. "She'll probably request assignment to a training command," he said. "Teaching, instruction, that kind of thing. Don't try to talk her out of it." "Why not?" Raines asked, "if she's as good as you say." "Because people like her have already given enough." Maddox's voice was firm but not unkind. "They've spent years in places most of us can't imagine, doing things most of us couldn't handle. At some point, they earn the right to pass on what they know instead of using it." Raines watched the SUV disappear into the desert heat, carrying with it the only person who really understood what Mara had been through, what she'd survived, what she'd sacrificed. The rest of the program continued without incident. Mara completed her remaining evaluations with quiet competence, Not the explosive performance she displayed during the ghost knife exercise, but solid, professional execution that reminded everyone she was exactly where she belonged. On graduation day, she stood in formation with the rest of her class, no different from any other soldier receiving orders and moving on to the next assignment. But those who'd been there, who'd seen what happened when someone gave her permission to be dangerous, carried that knowledge with them. Some secrets were too important to forget, even when they were too classified to share. That final evening, Mara packed her gear with the same precision she'd unpacked it with, every item in its place, every strap exactly where it needed to be. Through the window, she could see other graduates celebrating, laughing, making plans, building friendships that might last a lifetime. She felt the familiar weight of isolation, the knowledge that she'd always be separate, always be other, always be the one with secrets she couldn't share. But there was something else there too, something that felt like peace. She'd endured, she'd survived. She'd proven to herself that the conditioning hadn't broken her, that she could still operate at the highest level, that the injury hadn't taken away what made her useful, what made her dangerous, what made her valuable. And more than that, she'd learned something about strength that she'd forgotten somewhere in those 3 years of classified missions. That sometimes endurance was more important than execution. That sometimes the hardest battles were the ones nobody else could see. That sometimes dignity didn't speak. It simply acted. The wolf doesn't announce itself to the sheep, her first instructor had told her years ago. It doesn't need to. It knows what it is. And that knowledge is enough. Mara closed her locker, shouldered her pack, walked out of the barracks without looking back. Tomorrow she'd report to Special Operations Training Command. Tomorrow she'd start teaching others what she knew, passing on the skills that had kept her alive in places where survival wasn't guaranteed. But tonight she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction, not pride, not celebration, just the simple acknowledgement that she'd done what needed to be done. She'd failed every test they gave her, and in doing so, passed the only one that really mattered. The test of enduring humiliation without losing yourself, of being underestimated without internalizing it, of knowing your worth even when nobody else could see it. Some people spend their whole lives trying to prove themselves to others, but the most dangerous people are the ones who don't need to. The ones who know exactly what they're capable of and choose silence over spectacle, containment over display, mission over ego. They're the ones you never see coming. The ones who change everything with 3 simple words. The ones who remind you that appearances are always deceiving and underestimation is always a mistake. Because the quietest person in the room is often the most dangerous, not because they're hiding weakness, but because they're containing strength. And when that containment ends, when permission is finally given, when the leash comes off the guard dog, what happens next is something nobody ever expects. There's a certain kind of person who walks through the world carrying invisible weight, not the weight of trauma, though that's there too, but the weight of capability that can't be revealed, of competence that must stay hidden, of strength that only shows itself when authorization is granted. These people don't ask for recognition, don't demand respect, don't need validation from those who lack the clearance to understand what they've done or where they've been. They just do the work, complete the mission, survive the test, and when it's over, when the crisis has passed and the danger has been neutralized, they fade back into the background, unremarkable again, forgettable again, just another face in the crowd, just another name on a roster, just another soldier following orders. But those who have seen them work, who have witnessed what happens when permission is granted and containment ends, they carry that knowledge forever. They understand that the world is full of quiet warriors, people who have sacrificed pieces of themselves in places that don't officially exist, people who have done things that never officially happened, people who have learned to compartmentalize so deeply that failure becomes a performance and success becomes classified. Mara Keene was one of those people. For 3 years she'd operated in the shadows, moving through denied territory, eliminating high-value targets, extracting assets from impossible situations, perfect record, zero casualties, 100% success rate. She'd become the kind of operator that legends were built on, except there would be no legends, no stories, no recognition, just classified files in secure databases that most people would never know existed. And then an IED had changed everything. Not because it had broken her, but because it had raised questions. Could she still operate at that level? Was the conditioning still intact? Had the injury compromised her ability to compartmentalize? The brass needed answers, so they'd sent her to advanced combat training, told her to blend in, to appear normal, to suppress everything that made her extraordinary and see if the conditioning still held. For 2 weeks she'd done exactly that, followed orders that hurt more than any physical injury ever could, failed drills she could have passed with her eyes closed, endured mockery from people who'd never faced real danger, watched herself get marked for discharge while containing the very skills that could have saved her career with a single demonstration. It had been the hardest mission of her life, not because it was dangerous, but because it required her to be vulnerable, to be weak, to be dismissed and underestimated and humiliated, while knowing she could end all of it with 3 simple words. But she hadn't spoken those words, hadn't broken containment, hadn't violated the conditioning. She'd endured, and in enduring she'd proven something more valuable than any combat record. She'd proven that the Ghost Knife program hadn't broken her. It had refined her, turned her into something stronger than ordinary soldiers could ever be. Someone who could carry extraordinary capability while appearing completely ordinary. Commander Maddox had seen it, had recognized what everyone else had missed, and with 3 words he'd given her permission to be exactly what she was, not for glory, not for vindication, but for verification, to prove to the brass that their investment hadn't been wasted, that Mara Keene was still the weapon they'd spent 3 years creating, still the operator they'd need when the next impossible mission came along. But after verification came choice, and Mara had chosen teaching over operations, not because she couldn't do the work anymore, but because she'd already given enough. 3 years of her life, pieces of her identity, the ability to move through the world without carrying secrets that isolated her from everyone around her. She'd earned the right to pass on what she knew instead of using it, to help create the next generation of quiet warriors instead of being one. Some would say that was a waste, that someone with her skills should stay operational, keep taking the missions nobody else could handle, keep sacrificing herself for objectives that would never be publicly acknowledged. But those people didn't understand what it cost: the loneliness, the isolation, the constant weight of being someone you couldn't talk about in places you couldn't mention, doing things that never officially happened. Mara understood, and she'd made her choice: teaching, instruction, passing on the knowledge that had kept her alive, helping others learn to compartmentalize without losing themselves, showing them how to be dangerous without being broken, how to carry extraordinary capability while appearing ordinary, how to endure underestimation without internalizing it. Because that was the real lesson, not tactics, not techniques, not the physical skills that could be taught in any advanced combat course, but the mental and emotional discipline required to be truly effective, to know your worth when nobody else can see it, to endure humiliation without breaking, to be underestimated and choose dignity over defense, to contain strength instead of displaying it, to wait for authorization instead of demanding recognition. Those lessons couldn't be taught in a classroom. They had to be lived, experienced, endured, and Mara had endured them all. She'd walked through fire and come out the other side still whole, still capable, still dangerous, but also still human, still someone who valued connection over isolation, teaching over operations, passing on knowledge over using it. The course record would eventually be broken. Someone else would run those 14 seconds down to 13, then 12. Eventually, her name would fade from the board, forgotten by everyone except those who'd been there, who'd seen what happened when a SEAL commander gave 3 simple words and a failing staff sergeant became the most dangerous person on the range. But the lesson would remain. written in the quiet understanding of those who witnessed it, in the changed perspective of trainees who'd spent 2 weeks mocking someone they should have respected, in the professional growth of instructors who'd almost made a catastrophic mistake, in the careful consideration of brass who'd learned that sometimes the best operators are the ones who appear to be failing. Because appearances are always deceiving, and underestimation is always a mistake. The quietest person in the room might be the most dangerous. The one who's failing might be the one who's most capable. The one who seems broken might be the one who's most whole. And the one who never asks for recognition might be the one who deserves it most. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. And in that action, in that perfect execution, in that moment of revelation when containment ends and capability is finally displayed, the whole world learns what quiet professionals have always known. That real strength doesn't announce itself, doesn't demand recognition, doesn't need applause. It just does the work, completes the mission, survives the test, and then moves on to the next one. Silent, contained, unbreakable, until the moment someone gives the order, and then for just a few seconds everyone sees exactly what was there all along, hidden in plain sight, waiting, ready, lethal. Ghost knife active. 3 words, that's all it took. 3 words to change failure into perfection, weakness into strength, dismissal into respect. And Staff Sergeant Mara Keene from a soldier they were ready to discharge into the instructor they'd never forget. Not because she demanded it, but because she earned it. The hard way. The quiet way. The only way that really matters. The wolf doesn't announce itself to the sheep. It doesn't need to, and neither did she.